Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and welcome to a new course together. This is a course in history, but history in a way different than the way I have taught it in my other courses, which you may have had with me. It is history as it has been written down through the many centuries of Greco-Roman antiquity, so as to make history itself a subject for people like us to learn about. What do I mean? Well, what is history? History is what has happened in the past, but history is also what we read in books. Are the two the same thing? Is what we are pursuing some form of experience or empathy with past events? Or is it simply a species of literature which shares pretty much the same spirit as, one might say, Jane Austen or J.R.R. Tolkien? I expect that some of us are quite content to merely read history for the special pleasure that reading history as a subject of all reading gives us. And in that case, our pleasure will be heightened by factors that turn out to be extraneous to any particular experiences of the past. We will value an author's style, or will be attracted by its earth-shaking subject. But bear in mind that the charm of an author's style in describing past events has nothing to do with how those events occurred, some of which might have been anything other than charming. Nor did most contemporaries of great events have much opportunity to participate in them, or even to recognize them as great. So is our interest in the great events of history, reading about the great events of history, some kind of artificial imposition that we make on the past, celebrating in hindsight what the actual historical actors would scarcely have noticed themselves? Unlike experiencing history, which we do passively, writing history leaves us with no alternative but choosing. If you are writing a history book, you must choose from the vast swim of records and evidence that survive the experience of the past and attempt to reconstruct what happened. Now, what that means, of course, is that you accept a certain amount of choice already having been made for you, because you can only write about a past that has actually left records of evidence. Without them, you have no history book to write, any more than a district attorney has a case. But human beings tend to scatter records and evidence almost as promiscuously as they do litter. And this may sound surprising, especially to those who may think that history is full of unsolved mysteries and unanswered questions. But the truth is that more often than not, the problem of history and of history writing in particular is more like feast than famine. There are too many solutions and not enough mysteries, too many answers and not enough questions. So managing the feast requires action on the historian's part if he is going to write history and not merely passively receive it. It requires that a writer of history possess at the very least some active but also subjective qualities like insight or empathy or previous knowledge of such experiences. And as we will see momentarily, managing this feast may also call out some higher order ideological commitments as well. But on whatever basis a history writer does this, managing the feast of history requires action. It requires choosing. One simply cannot write about everything. One simply cannot even write about everything that took place in a single historical day, much less everything in a historical event. In fact, one even has to choose what one is going to call an event if one is going to write about it. For instance, the assassination of Julius Caesar, for example. That looks like a historical event. It's one thing that happens on one particular day, March 15th, 44 BC, and it occurred in one place, that is Pompey's Theater in Rome. And so it looks on the surface like an event that one can write about in a very circumscribed and neat sort of way. It is an event that everybody recognizes as a historical event with nice boundaries. But isn't there something that one might feel about it if one were to write about the assassination of Julius Caesar? Isn't there something that one would like to say about what had happened before the Ides of March and elsewhere in Rome, and what happened to Rome afterward? The assassins were granted a general amnesty within days after the assassination. but they would all ultimately perish in a series of battles against Mark Antony and Octavian in the years that followed. Uh, so is that part of the event? How long can we say that this time of span, the time span of an event, or even something as discrete as the assassination of Julius Caesar really is? And so you see, writing history begins with choosing. And one aspect of that choosing is decided for us in advance by what is capable of being known about an event. The other aspect involves the choice we make about what event and then what aspects of the event that we want to end up focusing on as we write. And if all of this makes your head swim, then that's good, because that will nudge us in the right direction to the question that I want you to ask, and that is this: how have historians in the past managed this feast, managed this complicated work of choosing, of history writing? How conscious have they been of the temptations to color and adjust, of the need to sort and choose, and of the inevitability of interpretation, and all the while somehow managing not to surrender to weariness and cynicism about the whole project? That, in large measure, is what this course is going to be all about. Our course is about the history of how the great historians of Greco-Roman antiquity have gone about the task of writing history. Now, the term we give for this writing of history is historiography. And I now find myself pushed at last to give a provisional, however clear-cut and unavoidable definition of what history writing, that is, of what historiography is. I define historiography as a prose narrative of events based upon systematic inquiry into words, actions, events, ideas, and experiences which occurred in the past and which have left verifiable evidentiary trails in the author's present. Now, that is a very long definition. In fact, not only long, but many of its terms are very freighted. So let me unpack the luggage of all those numerous and ponderous adjectives. First of all, history, I say, is prose narrative. You see, history is different from a Homeric epic poem or even from Shakespeare's history plays because it is not poetry, and it almost always is not an oral performance, even if it was read aloud publicly in antiquity. As we will see in a moment, history's origins may indeed lie very near the recitation of epic poetry making or something like that. But the fundamental difference is that history writing is prose and that it is a narrative. And its purpose is informing rather than entertaining or even edifying. Even if it does manage to do those other things, entertaining and edifying, those goals are wholly subsidiary to the goal of informing the audience. The second thing in our definition of historiography is that historiography is based upon systematic inquiry. History cannot be confected from the historian's imagination and still be history. It cannot exist without asking questions, without examining and cross-examining, without being concerned to establish that some one particular thing happened at one particular time rather than at another. In fact, the word history is itself simply the Greek word for inquiry, historia, or more properly in the Ionic dialect of Herodotus, historiae. This is the term that first appears in Herodotus, on whom a lot more in the coming lectures. Then, getting back to our definition, if we unpack it still further, we see that historiography relies on verifiable evidentiary trails. It is this evidence that is the highest object of the inquiry and becomes the subject of the prose narrative. It cannot be invented. It cannot be mere hearsay, fable, or myth. Hearsay, fables, and myths are what epics and dramas can incorporate, but not history, which wants us to use evidence that can be verified, or returned to and examined by others, or recognized by others as having validity. Now, of course, this is not to say that fables and myths, even hearsay, may not contain elements that some evidentiary use that have some evidentiary use. The Iliad is an epic poem, and that doesn't mean that the Trojan War in some form didn't happen, that Troy or Ilium was just a figment of Homer's imagination. But what this all means is that historiography wants to function on the kind of evidence that one would find in a court of law rather than in a novel. So there we have it, our long definition. Historiography is a prose narrative of events based upon systematic inquiry into words, actions, events, ideas, and experiences which occurred in the past and which have left verifiable evidentiary trails in the author's present. There we have, too, history as it was envisioned by the 19th century positivists or theorists of historical inquiry, such as the man you see in front of you, the German scholar Leopold von Ranke, who stated that history is wie es eigentlich gewesen, that is, how things actually happened. Accordingly, the 19th century positivistic outlook on history was to use a cross-section of the nascent hard sciences like archaeology and numismatics, together with the writings of the ancient historians, to try to piece together a complete understanding of the ancient past. The ancient historiographers, which we will be encountering in our course together, such as Herodotus, whom I have already mentioned, Thucydides and Xenophon on the Greek side of things, and Polybius, Sallust, Tacitus, and Ammianus Marcellinus on the Roman, were approached entirely for what information they could offer scholars about the past, and not as writers of literature at all. However, in the 20th century, and one might even continue that into the 21st century, but definitely in the early 20th century, this attitude began to change somewhat, with a greater appreciation for the literary qualities inherent in the historiographical project. For instance, if we were to take our definition of historiography that I just gave a moment ago, 20th century classicists and 21st century classicists but definitely in the early part of the 20th century, began to note that, yes, ancient historiography was written in prose, but the ancients themselves saw the Homeric poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and certainly the Trojan War, as historical. And if that is the case, which it is, then it is a very important question to ask whether and to what extent the earlier historiographers were influenced by the Homeric poems and the ethos of epic poetry more generally. And we're going to see that the answer to that is to a great deal. Likewise, regarding the question of systematic inquiry, the positivist perspective on history would require, as I stated earlier, to deny that history can be confected from the historian's imagination and still remain history. And yet, every single historiographer from the ancient canon of writers included, just to give one example of such confection, speeches in their writings, which the historical actors in their narratives were supposed to have delivered on the particular occasions under investigation. Now, it is obvious to point out that in the absence of electronic recording devices, any verbatim recording or written record of such speeches would have been impossible. And therefore, these speeches, although the authors purport them to be what actually happened, they are much more the products of the imaginations of the historiographers. Certainly no modern historian would ever countenance such a practice as inventing speeches and putting them into the mouths of historical figures. But as I just said, every ancient historiographer did exactly this. Modern scholars, therefore, began to ask important questions as to the reliability of these speeches. Also to examine other questions like the influence of ancient rhetorical educational practices on the authors themselves. What were the expectations of genre? And even more importantly, what were the artistic and ideological commitments of the historiographers, which may have motivated them to state certain ideas inside these speeches? Lastly, regarding the question of evidence, the old positivist idea that history cannot be based on myth or hearsay, but only cold, hard, verifiable facts, raises the question of what to do when the ancient sources themselves often delight in reporting hearsay, rumor, and innuendo, so as to color their narratives of events with their own particular biases and perspectives. And here I'm thinking particularly about the Roman historian Tacitus, whose works are peppered with such innuendos and rumors. Now, all of this may suggest to you that the modern perspective is one of hopelessness, and that one cannot ever hope to wrest historical truth away from the ancient writers of history. They are, as all authors are, simply too beleaguered by their own prejudices, perspectives, and biases to reconstruct how things actually happened. Now, that is an extreme position, although some, admittedly in a minority, do hold to this defeatist point of view. They are often called postmodernists. A minority who essentially view it as impossible to get at any kind of historical truth that is to be found inside of text. But that is not the perspective that I think is really the most rational, and certainly not the one that we are going to hold. The correct view is to hold a middle view, I think. And that is, we can recognize and analyze the perspectives and biases and methodological limitations of the ancient authors under investigation, while at the same time beginning the knowledge that they are, gaining the knowledge that they are transmitting to us, all the while verifying it and supplementing it with the other disciplines adjacent to historical inquiry, like archaeology, numismatics, papyrology, and epigraphy. And so, with all of these caveats in mind, we are now going to embark, after this very short introduction, on a very long exploration of those authors whom I've enumerated, of an examination of the ancient Greek and Roman historians. But first, we must begin by setting the stage for their emergence by outlining the earlier precursors to the awakening of the Greek historical spirit in Greece, and it is to that subject that we will now turn in our next lecture. Thank you.